Good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see a good full screen of participants, and thank you very much for joining. We're very much looking. Thank you, Peter, for leading this lecture, and we're very much looking forward to hearing what you have to say. So I think, without further ado, over to you, Peter. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm really sorry that this is not actual rather than virtual. But sadly, we are a COVID household this week. Sue's on day 11 and I'm on day 7. And despite government guidance, which says you can go out and do what you like after day 5, it seems really uncharitable to do that whilst we're both positive. So here I am back at home. This rather resembles the last 2 years, really, on and off, which is sitting here addressing people's faces through a screen. What I was proposing to do is I'll do a minute or two of introduction. I was proposing to speak for something around 45 minutes and then see, Nicholas, whether there are any questions that anybody wants me to answer. And on the assumption that nobody on the call is an evil journalist, I'll answer anything and try and be honest about it, providing that people don't immediately make me appear in the Daily Mail tomorrow morning. So that's my plan. Let's see if I can keep to it. So just in introduction, I'd say a fair number of you I know pretty well, but for those who don't know me, I spent a lifetime's career in transport. I was the Commissioner of Transport at Transport for London for 9.5 years, firstly for Ken Livingstone when he was the Mayor, and then subsequently during nearly all of Boris Johnson's mayoralty. And since then, I was asked in July 2015 to become the chair of Network Rail. Allegedly, that's a part-time job, but if you ask my wife, she'd deny that that's really true. And I've been the chair of Network Rail now for, since July 2015. So July 2022 will be, I think, year 7 or 8, something like that. Anyway. And the difference between the two is the difference between Transport for London and Network Rail is not only that TfL is a multimodal organisation, but only in London, and Network Rail is a national organisation, but only railway infrastructure and a bit of operations. But it's more fundamental than that, which is that Transport for London. I was responsible. I didn't do everything because I had 30,000 people and a lot of contractors who worked for me. But Transport for London is a comprehensive organisation and can generally be held responsible for virtually everything that goes on in transport in London. Not quite, but pretty comprehensively. Network Rail is one of a whole series of organisations in the railway industry, and it's the railway industry together that delivers Great Britain's railway network. And that's at the heart of the issues about how the industry works and how good it is at doing what it does. And I'm not going to spend all my time comparing TfL and the railway industry, except to say that you could, and the mayor did, both mayors did, hold me wholly responsible for the activities of TfL. Whether or not they were performed actually by the organisation or by contractors or by people we license. But on the railway, Network Rail is only responsible for some of the railway, all of the railway infrastructure, which is obviously a big deal. But there are many things in your journey on the railway which Network Rail is only partially responsible for, and where in many cases it's quite unclear who really is in charge. So as I say, I've been at Network Rail since July 2015. The railway itself, of course, was privatised in the middle 90s with private sector train operating companies, rolling stock companies, which were successively sold more than once and gained a great deal of value. And then the infrastructure, which was originally Railtrack. Railtrack was a public corporation in the private sector, People bought shares in it. The shares traded for a long time, but literally, rather, it crashed to its destruction after the Hatfield accident of 2001, in which it was found to be terribly wanting in the way that it was maintaining the basic infrastructure of the railway network. And many of the shareholders, maybe some of the people on the call, lost quite a lot of money because in effect it really did collapse as a private sector company. Its replacement was Network Rail, and one of the interesting things about Network Rail in its first incarnation in 2001 was that it was created by a government that it was the Blair government, the Blair with Brown as the Chancellor, and they created a corporation that had the appearance of a private sector corporation. It didn't have any shareholders. Nobody would have invested any money. It had members, Curious Construction, supposed to hold the board and the management to account, but it was able to borrow money underwritten by the government, but not on the government's books. It was a fantastic construction in the true sense of the word, fantastic. And the consequence of its construction like that was that by the time I turned up in July 2015, it had borrowings of 50 odd billion. In fact, I think it's still true. We've paid some of them back, but Network Rail's borrowings when it was allegedly a private sector company were roughly equal to the national debt of New Zealand, which is quite an achievement for even a capital rich private company. Anyway, Network Rail carried on like that from 2001 to 2014, and then in the autumn 2014, the party ended because the government statisticians decided that actually it was wholly financed by government payments through the complex financial arrangements of the railway, and it was reclassified as a nationalised industry. It came on the government's books, the debt came on the government's books, and despite the fact that the management were told that it wouldn't make any difference, of course it makes a huge difference if you've got the Secretary of State for Transport as your only shareholder, and your borrowing is part of the Treasury's national debt. And my appointment in July 2015 was as a consequence of that, because the then government, Patrick McLaughlin, who was then the Secretary of State for Transport, decided that he wanted to see some people on the board who he trusted, who would make the thing perform more like a company owned by the government and less like one that actually really had no effective control and could borrow what it liked. And all of that is relevant to where the railway is going today, because it's part of the tortuous history of the last 30 odd years. But it explains why Network Rail is now, it explains that Network Rail is now a creature of government, that it's quite strongly controlled by government, as you'd expect. That government is particularly concerned with its level of borrowing and how much it spends on enhancements, and that has been in recent years part of the problem of why railway schemes have been apparently pursued, sometimes abandoned, sometimes not finished, or one or two times done quite badly. And it's partially about how Network Rail is managed, and it's partially about the history, which was that it was a concern which had limitless borrowing capacity at quite cheap interest rates, and now is totally controlled by the government. So all of that is a precursor to saying that the railway industry has also had some other characteristics. So privatisation of the train companies has been enormously successful, in the sense that passenger traffic has doubled in the last 20 years before COVID. The railway that was able in the 90s to have opportunistically people running extra trains to derive marginal revenue, by the time we got anywhere near the start of COVID 2 years ago, it was a very, very crowded railway with much less space to innovate. And also, it's fair to say, much more constrained contracts. The Strategic Rail Authority, some of you remember, was abolished in 2008. Franchising was then done directly by the Department of Transport. It's a very hands-on situation. My former colleague Richard Brown, a good old railway person, he was on the Network Rail board with me. He was put on with me when I joined in 2015. His view as a professional railwayman was that actually the only railways in the world that might be more closely controlled by the state than the British one was either North Korea and or Russia, because in fact the government specifies not just the general level of service, it specifies recently in franchises the individual trains, how long they are, what sort of carriages they are, and famously what sort of seats you sit in. So you can characterize that railway in the last years of the 2010 to 2020 decade as one where the government had progressively taken a lot more control. So the story about the future of the railways today really starts with the May 2018 timetable change, which many of you will no doubt recall was a complete debacle both in Northwest England and on Thameslink. And the reasons for that were different in each case. In Northwest England, Network Rail had promised to complete an electrification scheme, and we failed to complete it, which was our fault, and for which I've had to apologise publicly in a number of quite difficult fora. In Thameslink, it wasn't apparent until the day the timetable started that the operator didn't actually have enough staff to run it in the right places, and the timetable, for those who can remember it, in both north and south of Thames was a pretty shambolic experience for people for a good 6 months. It became apparent to the then Secretary of State, Chris Grayling, that things were really quite badly wrong on the railway. But when he tried to look for somebody who was really could accept that total responsibility in the way that I would have done in Transport for London, he frankly couldn't find anybody. In the end, it turned out that he was the man responsible for the railway, because the railway was so divided into parts that everybody else had contributed some part of the problem, but nobody was wholly responsible for fixing it. And Chris did, I think, a very bold move indeed. Now, I didn't say at the beginning, but nearly everybody senior in the railway has done some review of it in the past 15 years. My shelves behind me are not littered with railway reviews. Actually, they're littered with transport strategies for London, but I could fill quite a decent pair of shelves in that bookcase with people who've reviewed the railway in various parts for the last 15 years. But Chris realised, and he was right, that nobody had ever been asked to review the whole structure of the railway industry with a view to making it fit to what the passengers and freight actually wanted. And he therefore commissioned Keith Williams, who was then the chief executive of British Airways. I think he might have recently stepped down, to do a review of the total organisation of the railways and look at whether or not it suited passengers' needs. One or two of you on the call might well know Keith. He's a very decent guy, and in fact, what I would say, the reason why I'm mentioning about Chatham House rules is when Boris became the Mayor of London in 2008, he put various people on the board, some of whom were quite useful to me and some of whom were no bloody use at all. But one of the people he did put on who was incredibly useful was Keith Williams, who then certainly was the chief executive of British Airways. Keith's an accountant. He's a shrewd guy. He's good at listening. He understands what customer service in the transport industry means because he'd done it in British Airways. And he was, in my view, absolutely ideal to do this review of the railway. So this is the review. Some of you, I hope you've all seen it. You don't have to have read it. But Keith started that in the summer of 2018. He talked to lots and lots of people around the country, both the railway industry itself and the users of the railway, passengers and freight, public authorities, regional bodies and regional governments. And he rightly drew his conclusion about what the railway should look like for the future, bearing in mind what customers told him they wanted from the railway. And what they told him was that people were fed up with it not acting as a network, that people didn't trust its fares and ticketing, that too often it didn't suit the journeys that they wanted to make, not because they couldn't make them, but because the standards of service that they received were very different from different train companies, and it was very difficult to make the railway look coherent. And as a simple example of that, I think that most people, including me and my family, don't trust railway ticketing. you know that if you try hard enough and go on the internet long enough and speak to enough people selling tickets, you can get the same journey cheaper. And if I sit here in the summer, when my adult kids go down to St Ives for our week in Tregenna Castle Hotel, then if I sit here for a couple of hours on a Sunday afternoon in July, I can probably, by buying them a whole forest of cardboard tickets and making them change at places that they don't want to change, like Exeter St David's and Newton Abbot, I can probably get their journey significantly cheaper than if I just bought them 4 returns from Paddington to St Ives. And people hate that. People don't like the fact that too often they get surcharged when they've got the wrong ticket on the train, on the wrong train. Trainline have made a big good business out of the fact that people don't trust the railway's information and ticketing. And that's really unsatisfactory. And Keith's conclusion, as far as passengers, was that actually people wanted the railway to act as a network. And it wasn't acting as a network because of the way that it was franchised and because of the contractual behaviour of the people who are operating it. So he was on his way to drawing those conclusions before COVID struck. COVID, of course, changed everything overnight because the passenger traffic very much disappeared. Freight has actually kept, freight's increased actually since COVID, which is a good thing. But overnight, the existing structure of the railway industry and the franchises, which were based to a greater or lesser extent for all the franchisees on revenue risk, they couldn't take a week of not having any revenue. So overnight, the government had to turn them all into effectively operating contracts. So, and actually that's quite suited Keith's review, because one of his conclusions was that the franchising system, whilst it had delivered huge increases in passenger numbers, in the end was no longer fit for purpose. It was too complex. The contractual behaviour of the individual train companies was too directed at contractual fulfilment and not at passenger and freight satisfaction, and that things ought to change. So the publication of his report was, of course, delayed because government had different and better things to do during COVID. During the course of discussion with the latest Secretary of State, Grant Shapps, it became apparent that Grant was very wedded towards Keith's view, which is that there should be a public authority responsible to government, but separate from it, to run the railway system. Grant actually put his name on the report, which some people might have taken offence at when he didn't write it, but actually Keith and most of us thought it's a great thing, because the Secretary of State committing himself to being to supporting a fundamental review of one of Britain's most complex and biggest transport providers is a good thing. And in the end, that was published in April 2021. And as I said, Keith's recommendation is that there should be an arm's length body which both subsumes Network Rail, takes over the railway infrastructure, takes over the activities of Network Rail in operating the railway, signalling and so forth, and also takes over franchising train companies. And that body can make the trade-off decisions between the infrastructure and train operations, and can present a much more unified face of the railway to its customers, both in passengers and freight. That's the basic conclusion of this report. There's a lot else in it, and Keith got to that conclusion not by contemplating solely the structure of the railway, but by contemplating how best to suit customers' needs. And I think it's a really important conclusion, because as an aside, one of the things I'd say is that the railway is a hugely complicated system. David Waboso, very talented engineer who worked with me at Transport for London, said to me once that he thought the railway was one of the most complex set of systems that you could imagine. And not only is it complex, not only is some of it very old, and its age and technology is variable, but it's also got the public wandering about all over it. So, and it is complicated to operate. And actually finding a public authority that can make the trade-offs between the track capacity and the timetable, decide what the right levels of train service are, and then contract them, is a rather different animal than a government department deciding what train service to let in a franchise, and a public authority owning the infrastructure. So that's Keith's recommendation, and the rest of what I was going to talk about for a few minutes is about how we get to that, to what he's proposing. I think the first thing to say is that actually, had somebody proposed, they never did, but had somebody proposed to me that Transport for London should be split up into its constituent parts, I would have reacted very badly. I think TfL has proved over 20 odd years that it is the right organisation to serve London and to transport London. I don't feel, and neither does Andrew Haines, my chief executive, the same way about Network Rail. Network Rail is a creation of privatisation. It's not a bad organisation, and with Andrew in charge of it, it's got a lot better because he's devolved it, and he's a railway operator. He's made it fit more closely with the train companies, and I think we can be reasonably assured that there won't be any more timetable catastrophes like May 2018. But it's not ideal. It's not ideal to have the franchising separated and part of a government department. It's not ideal for the Secretary of State personally to sign off franchise awards in a very public sector sort of way. And if I contrast that, for example, with letting bus contracts in London, I never consulted either mayor in my time at TfL over who I would award a bus route contract to. I thought that was my business. His business is to make sure that the organisation does its job properly in general terms and the bus service runs properly. My job was to make sure in detail that we contracted the right levels of service. And I think that's a very important distinction. And I think, as Chris Grayling found in May 2018, that if you bring all that stuff too close to politicians, firstly, they get the blame for it, and then they have to interfere in some decisions that really ought not to be at their level at all. Here's a good example. Again, Chatham House rules. Andrew and I and our colleagues in the southern region were concerned for quite some time that the 0105 Waterloo to Southampton, which in the late 1980s used to be the newspaper train, stood between us and an hour's more engineering possessions every night of the week on the southwestern main line. Now, the 0105 hasn't carried newspapers since the late 1980s, and certainly on Mondays to Thursdays, usually it had a small collection of people who'd really enjoyed themselves on a night out. But generally during the week, it only had 20 people on it, and fewer than that west of Woking and Basingstoke. And we wanted to withdraw the 0105 on the grounds that it wouldn't ever have run at all if it hadn't been a newspaper train. I discovered through a chance discussion with the rail minister, who was then Chris Heaton Harris, in the summer of 2020, that he'd been asked whether or not that train should run. They'd asked the rail minister to decide whether the 0105 Southampton ran from Waterloo on Monday to Thursday nights. Now, I've nothing against the rail minister, but that is an operational decision for the railway. That's not a political decision. That's not the same as whether there should be a direct service to Southampton, 7 days a week. And I think that single example demonstrates why there should be a separation between the daily operation of the railway and the politicians who find the money and who are in the end responsible for it. And I used to say to Boris, actually, in TfL, if he didn't like what I did, in the end, he should fire me. He shouldn't take the organisation to pieces. He should get rid of the commissioner and get somebody he trusts to deliver it. He didn't actually do that. Probably good for me. But actually, that's the sort of decision that needs to be made. So the present Secretary of State is very committed to in putting the Williams-Shapps rail review into legislation. So incidentally, as the Prime Minister, by an accident of complete accident of fate, Keith Williams and I happened to be on a call with the Prime Minister, and when he invited us to a meeting with him and the Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Secretary of State for Transport, at which they were debating whether or not this should be enacted. And you can say what you like about the Prime Minister, and I shan't comment further on anything except what he thinks about the railway. But actually, he was very emphatic, because I think that he could see in this plan the same relationship that government should have with somebody running, with a body running the railways, that he had when he was the Mayor with Transport for London. And maybe that's not a coincidence that Keith and I were there, but it certainly seems to me to be the right sort of outcome. So where are we now? Well, this plan is quite revolutionary. It needs primary legislation for a start. The legislation that abolished the Strategic Rail Authority propelled a whole number of decisions on the future of the railway directly to the Secretary of State. It is currently the Secretary of State's direct responsibility to be the deciding person on the franchises, and there are a whole load of other duties that accrue directly to him through legislation, which have to be changed to go to Great British Railways if it's to be a new body. You can't, in fact, set up a new public body without legislation, and you can't appoint people to it until it's reasonably certain that it goes through the Houses of Parliament. So we will need legislation for GBR. The department has been working quite hard at preparing it, and in fact, I would say quietly that one of the good things about this is that the department, having done railway franchising for 15 years, certainly at the most senior level, is also utterly committed to the Williams proposals, because they too realise that it isn't the ideal activity for civil servants who generally deal with policy rather than operational stuff. So legislation is being prepared. There's a lot to be done about that legislation, and it will have to go through both Houses of Parliament, and hopefully it will get there by midsummer or at the latest early autumn. There's also a lot to prepare in other ways. I mentioned that the contracts for train operators had to change when the pandemic started, and they are now being replaced by more permanent contracts, which by and large, or which wholly actually, reward operators for operating the specified service and not in accordance with the amount of revenue that's collected. That is pretty obvious. No commercial undertaking would ever want to take revenue risk on the railway in the present circumstances. We're still recovering from COVID. We don't yet know what the level of commuting will be in the medium term. We do know that leisure traffic's coming back. I was just looking at last week's figures this morning, and actually the weekends in leisure traffic are very close to, and in one or two weekends recently have exceeded the pre-COVID levels of railway traffic on Saturdays and Sundays. But during Mondays to Fridays, it's holding currently at about 65 to 70% of previous levels. That is a fairly big reduction in commuting. It's more marked in London and the South East, where there are probably more jobs that you can do at home, as many of us are doing currently, than there are in the north of England, Wales and Scotland, where the recovery is higher. But it's still not certain yet. And you wouldn't expect commercial PLCs to want to take revenue risk. In conceptual terms, they'd like to, but in practical terms, no shareholder would think the management were other than mad if they did. So the present contracts for performance of railway services don't have revenue as part of them, and indeed they're not likely to for some time. And Keith's view is that actually that's an opportunity. That's an opportunity to sort out some things on the railway which haven't been sorted out for some time. And when the market is capable of taking some revenue risk on the levels of passenger traffic and what management can do to incentivize it, then we should have reformed things in the railways enough for it to be in a better place. So, for example, I spent most of last summer and autumn working really hard with colleagues from the department on a proposition to the Treasury to invest money in fares and ticketing to replace the current flawed system of cardboard tickets and an impenetrable set of fares over time with something that looks more or less not the same, but similar to the way that you travel in London, which is to use a contactless payment card or a mobile phone with a fare structure that makes sense, and abolishing cardboard tickets, and probably with it most of the people who sell them in stations. And we got in the spending review, we got allocated 300 and odd million in order to start that process. And if that process is started now, by the time the railway market settled down, then you might much more easily expect a franchisee to be able to postulate what revenue it could generate by operating different and better services with a modern fare system that was network wide and made sense to the customers who used it. So Keith sees that as an opportunity. Not to beat about the bush, there's one other opportunity which is obvious, which I think might get us into some difficulty in the next few months, which is that actually, so we have currently, the railway got down to a level of income of less than 20% during COVID of what its previous income was, with a cost base that was nearly wholly the same. We're now back up to about 70% or so, as I said, on Mondays to Fridays, but there's still a huge income deficit on the railway compared with previously, for a level of service which is about 90% now of what it was pre-COVID, but with 70% of the income. If that was your business, you'd do something about it. The Treasury, not surprisingly, don't want to pay the additional cost of running the railway to make up for the fares that we don't have. And they see, and it's not surprising either, an opportunity for workforce reform, and they're pressing very heavily for that to be done because they object to paying far more for the railway for the same level of service for carrying less passengers. And if you put it like that, it's very hard to see that isn't a proposition that one should pay attention to. The government are paying a lot of attention to it. The staff on the railway on the whole, certainly on the operating side, have done rather well out of 25 years or so of privatisation. And for example, the real income levels of train drivers and guards particularly is far higher than it was equivalently before privatisation. So the Treasury are looking for workforce reform. Our trade unions know that. It wouldn't be a surprise to you if I said to you the trade unions don't fancy that prospect very much. And it may well be. In fact, we've just had a rather cardboard letter from the RMT telling us that they don't like either the prospect of a wage increase that doesn't match the current very high level of inflation, nor the working conditions that might result from greater flexibility. And we may, we're all negotiating fairly hard, both in Network Rail and the train companies, and we may wind up in a dispute with them. But it's hard not to see that that isn't the right proposition, because nobody else would run a business which was running 90% of its output with only 70% of its income and no certainty about getting the rest back. So I'm being very honest about that. I think that as far as the Treasury are concerned, and you might more or less have read this in the papers, as far as they're concerned, rail reform is conditional on some workforce reform. We are doing this in a very difficult environment. It is the case that inflation's very high. I don't think in any part of the rail industry anybody's got enough money to pay an 8% pay increase. So we may have some quite difficult times, but that wouldn't be the first time we've had difficult times, and it will be a circumstance in which the railway can't possibly afford to carry on as it is without a level of subsidy from the Treasury that the Treasury aren't prepared to give. So that's the sort of hard news about it. The better news out of this is that I think that what customers ought to expect, both freight and passenger customers, is a much more coherent railway. I've never been able to explain in public to either an individual or group of individuals precisely whose fault anything ever is on the railway, because it's always more than one person's fault. At TfL, if the Northern Line broke down, it was my fault. It was Mike Brown's fault. It was my fault. It was our railway. It didn't matter whether the rolling stock was leased. It didn't matter whether contractors were doing the upgrades, who the staff worked for. It was our fault. If you find a train delay today, and I could look on my mobile phone and find you a few today, it's always a mixture of infrastructure and the train operator. And until recently, we had some pretty dire contractual discussions about not really putting the thing right, but who paid for it. And I think that's a really bad thing to do in business. If the parties concerned with offering the public a service are more concerned with who takes the blame in financial terms if it goes wrong, then that won't result in tomorrow being better. And I've got some experience of that in TfL. We had the famous PPP on the underground. When we both, one of them collapsed and the other we bought our way out of. But my colleagues on the underground said to me, in both cases, the difference were the day after the PPP collapsed, the people who came together at 8 o'clock in the morning to look at yesterday's failures stopped trying to allocate the financial effects of the blame and started to work out how you stop what happened yesterday affecting tomorrow. And that's what you want of the railway. You want people to work together to make the railway run better tomorrow and more suit its customers. And that will be a really positive thing to come out of Great British Railways. There are some others. The opportunity is there to devolve railway management more than it's been done. Andrew Haines has devolved Network Rail. When I turned up, it was a very centralised organisation. It has and still has some very talented people in it, but a lot of decisions were taken at Milton Keynes, and really local managers didn't have much discretion. I think the opportunity is there to replicate what currently happens in Scotland, which is a devolved railway because Scotland's government has been given at least responsibility for the train operating company. And Alex Hines, who runs Scotland's railway, is in fact our employee at Network Rail, but also is in charge of the train company, which from the 1st of April actually is publicly owned, and can make decisions in Scotland about how the railway runs without necessarily reference to Network Rail in London or Milton Keynes or anywhere. And we're anxious to replicate that because there's a lot of regional interest in how the railway runs and a lot of regional interest in making sure it suits local and regional circumstances. And you'll have read the formation of Transport for the North, the integrated rail plan for the Midlands and the North, which the government published last November to howls of anguish, despite the fact that it represents £96 billion worth of investment in the next 25 years. And the howls of anguish were from people who thought that they needed more good railway in the future than that plan gave them. And I think that's a very significant local and regional pressure, which Great British Railways has to respond to. I'm going to finish in 7 or 8 minutes, Richard. So you don't and Nicholas, so you don't get too fed up with my voice. So one of the things I would say is that not only are we expecting GBR to be regionally focused and locally focused, but it also needs a plan. One of the things that I had to do when I came to Network Rail in 2015 was to review the plan for railway enhancements, which had been, in that case, formulated when Network Rail was had unlimited borrowing power and was a huge list of projects. Many of them didn't have business cases. It wasn't clear what some of them did. There were many advocates for some of the things on the plan. I found one of them, I couldn't find anybody to advocate why it should be done. That's a thoroughly bad way of planning a lot of public investment for the future of the railway. And I think the integrated rail plan that government published last autumn is a good start, but it doesn't cover the country. And what I was used to in Transport for London was a hierarchy which started with why transport is important. And transport is important because it creates economic growth, it creates jobs, it builds houses, it creates social cohesion, and it's sustainable. And if you break that down, what you need to know is if you're going to spend money on the railway, you need to know what the best projects are. You need to know what their business case is. You need somebody to have worked through how much they might cost, how long they might take to do. And then the railway could own that plan, and it could invite the government to nominate what it wanted to prioritise. We can't do that now because we haven't got one, whereas at TfL I did have a plan. And when famously Boris rang me up one evening when I was walking home from a restaurant, and he clearly was on his bike having had a very good dinner, and he said, Peter, why don't we build another cable car? And I thought, oh, here we go. I said to him, I'll tell you what, let's not build another cable car. Let's do the next thing in the transport strategy. And he said, what's that then? And I said, Crossrail 2. And I sold it to him because I knew what the best investment to do in London's transport was. We can't say that on the railway currently, but we will be able to say it in the future, because one of the things that Grant has already agreed, which is being worked on by the transition team which has been set up, is a whole industry strategic plan for the railway, which is a look ahead for 20 or 25 years. The government has agreed what its priorities for the railway are: meeting customers' needs, delivering financial sustainability, contributing to long-term economic growth, levelling up and connectivity, delivering environmental sustainability, which are great targets at a high level. And then underneath it, we're consulting over bringing together the elements of the individual plan for the railway, which will describe what the railway can do for Britain and from which the government can choose its future investment strategy. And then, by the way, we'll have a set of projects which we will have looked at and costed, which won't be costed as they're being built, and which are much more likely to be delivered on time and at a reasonable budget. And I think that whole industry strategy is hugely important to make sure that the railway does deliver both for passengers and freight. So that's where we are at the moment. There's a lot of hard work going on. I think the road with workforce reform might be quite difficult for a few months, but no doubt we'll get there as ever with the staff of the railway, who are brilliant people. One of the things on the railway is that everybody's committed to it vocationally. It's just like the health service. Actually, people work for the railway. Some of them are well paid, some of them are not so well paid, but they work for it because they believe in what the railway can deliver. And in fact, one of the interesting things I find when I go around is that when I talk to people, both our people at Network Rail and train company people and people in the wider industry, after about 5 or 10 minutes, everybody talks about the railway, because they've all worked for more than one employer and they care about the railway as a network, rather like the passengers want it to be, actually. So that's where we're headed. I think the last thing I'd say is that don't assume from the description. I am a great enthusiast for this plan. I think Keith has devised absolutely the right plan. I think the white paper is an excellent piece of work. Keith is continuing to be involved. He's currently chairing a Great British Railways transition advisory panel to help govern the preliminary work that needs to take place, and engagement is ramping up on it. But don't assume from what I'm saying that I think that necessarily Andrew Haines and I are necessarily part of the future. I think one of the essential things about GBR is that it is seen to be a fresh body. It's not Network Rail reincarnated. It is actually a fresh body. Government intends to appoint a fresh board for it. It intends to appoint a chief executive. I hope that Andrew Haines will apply, and I hope he's successful, because I think he's a fabulous, experienced railway person, and he's an excellent chief executive. I myself am 70 in next March, and I'm not expecting to be the chair of Great British Railways, simply because I'll be too old and it will be the start of something new. But I hope that there will be some good people to do it, and whether or not I'm there, and whether or not Andrew's there for that matter, this is the right plan for the future. It's not British Rail reincarnated. It will have, by government intent, some private sector train operators, and it will have some incentives to deliver good service to customers, both passengers and freight. And I'd simply leave you with the same comparison as I had at Transport for London, which is, you thought that Transport for London was an integrated body delivering transport in London. In fact, within it, we had people who were regulated and licensed, cab drivers and private hire. We had direct employees of the operating companies on the underground. We had contracts run by bus contractors. We had a contract for the overground, a contract for the DLR, all subtly different. But you didn't notice any of that because, I hope you didn't notice it, and I hope you still don't, because Transport for London looks like a coherent body. If we can get to Great British Railways being formed, and a railway which looks properly like a network and is set up to serve customers from Wicken Thurso to Penzance and from Aberystwyth to Lowestoft, and it's run partially by public sector people, partially by private sector people, its assets can either be wholly owned or leased. That's the same sort of model as TfL. And if we can get to that stage, and if we can get to a proper level of modern customer service alongside what you now expect from the internet and from shops and indeed from TfL, then I think that will be the basis of a decent railway in the third decade of the 21st century. So that's it, Nicholas. That's it, Richard. If you want me to answer any questions, I will. That's about 3/4 of an hour, and I badly need this cup of tea.
Thank you very, very much. Amazing insight. And I will now open to the floor and for any questions.
Thank you, Peter. That was fascinating. Like Nicholas just said. The one thing, I was at the Accelerate Rail conference a few weeks ago, and there was loads of talk about under the reform innovation in all parts of rail in this new post-COVID world that we're in. And one thing that Abu Siddiq of LNER said was that in order to be customer-centric, we need to be employee-centric. And basically in relation to that, I just wondered, to what extent do you think that employee engagement and experience directly translates to customer experience, and what changes or focuses are you doing to improve in that area, if so?
So there are two things in there. One of which is, you mentioned innovation, and I should have mentioned it in the talk. The railway is it has been pretty slow to innovate anything, partially because of Network Rail's relative sort of centralized nature, and partially because you only get innovation in franchises generally when they're put into a franchise bid. So if you didn't put it in year one, you won't get it by the end of years 7 and 10. It's not wholly true, but it's certainly a drag. And we are currently, and colleagues who are in the GBR transition team and some other non-executive colleagues more widely, are looking at the moment to see how best to stimulate innovation, and in particular, how to bring in private sector innovation in the new circumstances. I think it's very likely that you'll see that GBR has a much higher profile in encouraging innovation in a way that the railway system hasn't done for some time. And that's certainly our intention, and certainly government is pressing us to show how it is that we bring in innovation and we publish data openly so people can manipulate it and tell us what the railway needs to do that we haven't thought of ourselves. And I'm a convert to that myself, actually. I was I was persuaded at TfL that open data was a really sensible thing to do, and we never looked back, actually, because other people devised apps for travel in London much better than we could think of doing them. As far as employee engagement's concerned, we have clearly got a job to do on that. And I think one of the reasons we've got a job to do is because actually the railway landscape for many people has changed. Nearly everybody who spent any time on the railways worked for more than one employer. The management have changed more often than the workforce have in some cases. And I think that we have to get some stability there, realizing that actually people are pretty committed largely to the long-term aims of the railway. And if I'm honest, that creates a circumstance where on the one hand, people love the railway, but on the other, they don't like very much change. And I spend quite a lot of my time talking to people on the railway saying, actually, change is constant. I mean, if I look back on my career over nearly 50 years, virtually every promotional job I ever got until I became the Commissioner of Transport was through a reorganisation. And they're not to be feared in the circumstances where actually employment's pretty secure and the pension scheme's fantastic. And we have to work a bit harder on it. Well, we have to work a lot harder on it, actually. And I think ideally what you want is for the staff to feel that they're on the customer's side. And I think that, some of the things like our retail and ticketing system ought to work better to allow them to do it, frankly. I wouldn't want to be I'm sure you know, but there's a comedian who not only wrote a sketch, but a song about some poor soul on Virgin trains who got an enormous surcharge just by travelling on the wrong train. Well, forget the customer for a minute, it's pretty bad for them. But imagine what your job is if your job is to try to extract 100 quid out of some old lady who just got on the 4:30 as opposed to the 4:50. I don't think that's motivating. So we do have a lot to do in both of those areas.
I just have one question. You've been talking an awful lot about the passenger areas. How do you see GBR actually making sure that the tension between freight transport and passenger transport is better resolved than it is now?
So one of the unexpected benefits of COVID, there are many things that aren't benefits, but one of the benefits of COVID was that it enabled a fairly marginal reduction in the passenger timetable, which has allowed more freight traffic. And we think that that's permanent. And indeed, I'm, Steve, on a wider basis, I'm very respectful of the freight and particularly the logistics industries because they work on very thin margins, and I think they're very commercially dexterous. And I think the railway has a lot more to offer those industries than it has done in the recent past. And part of it is about timetable paths for freight trains, where I think that government is now quite supportive of us making sure that there are more paths. Part of it is about a renewed focus on logistics into city centres. You'll know that, in fact, it's really interesting, and I would say in the last 2 months, I've been approached by virtually every international parcel distributor looking at what the opportunities are for rail into city centres. And I think that we can do something about that. And I think GBR needs to have some people focused on that. Not the old Red Star parcel depots with acres of rooms, but actually just devoting a couple of platforms between 11 o'clock at night and 6 o'clock in the morning to unload parcels. That would be a good thing to do. We're also looking at helping the freight industry work out how to decarbonise rail freight, because the truth of it is that they're not subsidised by the public purse, other than a debate about track access charges. So if you're John Smith from GB Rail Freight and you're halfway through the 40-year life of 150 diesel locomotives, you don't want to be told that they'll be obsolete in 10 years. You want somebody to help find you a method of repowering them so at an economic cost. And we're looking at that too. There's a bit of a trade-off, because you'll know that actually in some cases there are paths in the timetable owned by freight companies that they don't want to give up for fear that one day they'll get some more traffic, which will fill it. And that's not very helpful if everybody's looking for other paths to actually run real trains. So we do need a bit of a trade-off there. And then the last thing is that, of course, HS2 is a wonderful opportunity, because one of the things that HS2 will do is to create a serious number of paths on the West Coast Main Line, past the golden triangle of the freight hubs in the Midlands up to Birmingham in the north of England. And actually one of the jobs of GBR will be to make sure that those paths are available for freight for the future. I don't think it's impossible to imagine that we might get in a situation of seeing trains for parcels, domestic parcels, running on a timetable basis. Actually, it really wouldn't surprise me, in the way that in my youth there were parcels trains in and out of major stations. And I think there's quite a good case for that. And I think that, as ever, I'm impressed enormously by the capability of the logistics industry in thinking through what those opportunities might be. and I'm expecting GBR to be able to respond to them.
Two questions for you, Peter. The first question is, do you think the London Underground should all run 24 hours a day instead of those few lines at the weekends? And should it be made illegal for train drivers to strike?
So on the first, it's not my business anymore, but I know what both Mike Brown would have said and Andy Byford would say now, which is that they would be delighted to run a system that was so modernised and up to date that you could contemplate running at night 2 nights a week out of 7. And the reason why the rest of it doesn't is because it needs to be repaired 7 nights a week rather than 5 nights a week. And that's the answer to that. The other thing is, the answer is we don't live in a society where striking is prohibited, and I wouldn't want to be the person to advocate that. I don't think, and I'm not. I don't think I'm an extreme socialist. I think that there's some basic human rights. However, I do think that actually the use of striking as a means of pressurizing employers and sometimes the state to pay money, if it's not to be derided by a large section of the population, you have to use it with care. And I can remember quite frequently on TfL the occasions on which we would move from industrial harmony to a complete breakdown in industrial relations overnight, which was more a reflection on the publicity that the trade unions sought for their dispute than it was about the attitude of the management. And I think one of the things that, as a result of COVID, is that the trade unions will have to be a bit more careful about assuming that they can stop the country and hold the government powerfully to ransom, when actually we've just proved that the country can carry on economically, even though only a fifth of the travel was by train for a prolonged period of time. So but they've got to be a bit careful about it. But I also think the employers have a responsibility too. You know, my experience over nearly 50 years is that you get the trade union you deserve, and if in fact the employer are unable to resist trade union pressure, then sometimes you need employers who are capable of responding. So those are my answers to that.
Rolling stock for passenger services. I believe there was some form of statements made that every time a franchise bid was put in, the bidders promoted new rolling stock, and there's been quite a number of delays in trains that have been ordered. And also, in some cases, I think may have been South West Trains. Their bid brought a new series of trains, new series of rolling stock in, which sidelined some rolling stock that was hardly new. Will Great British Railways have more control of the rolling stock? One of the other things about the latest rolling stock is that the interoperational connectivity. You've got the example of Great Eastern, where you've got 2 new fleets of trains, but if one breaks down, if it's the wrong train behind it, it can't couple up and push it forward. Is that one of the things that's going to be more managed by the Great British Railways as part of the situation going forward?
So they're good questions. I mean, I would certainly expect GBR to have a greater holistic look at the rolling stock on the railway as a whole. What's been quite difficult over the last, I mean, one of the troubles is this stuff lasts for 35 or 40 years. So the decisions you take this year reverberate through the railway for the life of the rolling stock. And then if your specifications change faster than the rolling stock's able to change, then you're displacing stuff that still, at least notionally, has a life to it. And that's actually, if you think back, that's been a feature of the railway for many years, and not excluded with British Rail, and in a case far more wasteful than any modern case. They built hundreds of steam locomotives, some of which were only running for 6 years before they were scrapped again. So you can't hold that as merely as an evil of the recent railway. Technological change has moved faster than the rolling stock market because the rolling stock lasts so long. Having said that, clearly you would like to think that every time a franchise was let, somebody took a view about what the relative life of the rolling stock was and what the costs of replacing it are. And indeed, one of the delicious ironies about all the fuss about the Pacer trains in northwest England is that whether or not he realises that the Mayor of Manchester was actually Chief Secretary of the Treasury when the franchise was let that prolonged their life to save money. And then so those decisions sometimes come back to haunt you. I think I would expect GBR to take a better and more holistic view. I wouldn't necessarily expect it not to have to prematurely scrap rolling stock if it was no longer fit for purpose. And I think the other thing is that the delays in the new train orders represent a rolling stock supply market that actually has moved up and down because of the variation in orders. I think it's been really quite difficult for them. At one stage, Bombardier and Derby were the only UK manufacturers. We've now got Hitachi and Newton Aycliffe, and we'll have Siemens factory in Gaul. And then as soon as you've got those suppliers are desperately wondering where the next order is. And the answer is that you're never going to get that completely flat, but you might well take a better long-term view about what rolling stock you needed, and therefore hope to make some better decisions about the relative lives of what you've got running on the railway, both not to prolong it unduly and not to scrap too much prematurely. How about that?
Very interesting in terms of a national rail for the people of the UK. But in the delivery, and I didn't really see it in the review, was the social aspect of what a national railway also has to envisage. And I've got a concern with some of the ministers in the current government who are saying that social value and that extension of bringing rail to the people is somewhat questioned at the moment. The second point I'd like to make is, if you do speak to Keith Williams, ask Keith Williams what has happened to the air industry over the last couple of months, where they have lost staff. They have not strategized inside the aviation sector. And at the moment, it's in quite a lot of chaos. So in terms of staff engagement, which was raised earlier, I think it's an important issue on how that engagement is brought into negotiations. And
Yep.
my final bit is, I understood from the present government that the Brexit was about bringing power back to the United Kingdom. And I'm hoping that that power isn't about anti-trade union flavour coming into government on the back of the investment that will have to be made in this project. And I do agree with you, Keith Williams is a good strategist and also was an excellent CEO with British Airways. Thank you.
So Pat, as ever, sharp questions. The social value issue is really interesting. I think it is in Keith's report, But more to the point, actually, one of the things I could have referenced and didn't was the Beeching revival, the Restore Your Railways campaign, which is very much a feature of this government's approach to connectivity and levelling up. Now, interestingly, nobody's said it as much, but everybody needs to know that there will never be. I've had the misfortune to have to read all of the 190 submissions because I was asked to validate the choices going forward of the ones that they were going to take forward. And the fact is that none of them will ever produce a revenue surplus. But that's not to say they won't get done. And I think one of the clarity that has been lost on the railway is not whether or not you run it solely for profit. You certainly don't, because the amount of government money going into the railway is absolutely massive. But actually, it's not clear where it's going. And that's a different issue. So we, together with Northern, which happens now to be a publicly owned train company, had a look at the economics of the Cumbrian coast, which is effectively round Barron, Furness, and up there to Carlisle. And that line costs, together with the operating expenses and Network Rail's expenses, less the revenue, it costs something like 70 million a year to run. I don't think that means that you shouldn't run it. I think it does mean that government should take a much more objective decision about why it's spending that money and what value it gets from it. And of course, the value it gets is that people would never otherwise get to work at Sellafield. Neither would those communities have any real connection with the outside world. And that's why people want Restoring Your Railway. You know, Oakhampton, which is we reopened last November. You know, I've never been to a day like it with brass bands. Everybody who was anybody in Oakhampton, they know that the reopening of their station will transform its economy. You know, so I think people are alive to that, and I would say not that wasn't a bad thing. In fact, it's a very good thing, and quite a lot of what the government's committed to in levelling up is actually giving better access to those communities for people to access work and education and health and so forth, but only that you should know how much it's costing you. On the points about the staff engagement, I mean, we're in a really interesting position because actually what's turned out as a result of Brexit is quite a large labour shortage at a time when actually there's a lot of pressure on employers and public sector employers to reduce costs. And I think that we haven't really seen that much on the railway. The railway is a very stable environment, partially because actually the pension scheme is so good, though it's also expensive and fairly the subject of discussion too. And I think that you're right, which is that you've got to be careful that you don't, at the time at which you're trying to save money, you don't devastate the morale of the staff so much that in the end you haven't got enough people to run the service. What I would say, of course, is that actually in comparison to the airlines and the coach industry and part of the bus industry, actually nobody on the railway was furloughed. It's really interesting. Nobody, apart from the open access train operators, nobody was furloughed. Everybody's employment was carried on, which is a remarkable achievement, really, and done wholly at the cost of public money. So you would be forgiven for the Treasury being a bit hard-nosed about the consequence of that, because in many of these other industries, what's happened is not only were people furloughed or in some cases sacked, but actually now the employers are trying to pay them less for doing the same job, which is sort of double whammy, really. And I think that I don't know how this is going to wind out. I mean, actually, I speak to Keith quite a lot because he's a talented manager and also a good friend. And I think one of the interesting things about the Royal Mail, which he's currently the executive chair of, is that he did a productivity deal himself at Royal Mail, which increased wages but sought more work for more wages. That's not a bad deal, actually. I quite like the sound of that. I'm not sure we're going to be able to do that on the railway simply because of the public subsidy. But you can see why that sort of deal might be attractive. And indeed, I don't think, there are some jobs that you just can't do more of. You can't, we've got signallers who do 3 12-hour shifts. That's enough. You can't ask people to do any more than that. You've got to attune what you're expecting people to do to what the components of the job are. But we're going to have to do something, because you can't run a business with 90% of the cost, or rather more than that actually, and 70% of the income. So it might be quite a difficult few months, because the trade unions obviously will take a view about what they're prepared to do and what they're not. How about that?
Although we're out of the EU now, do we still share cooperation and learning with our EU partners? And being surrounded at the moment with 2,500 lorries outside Ashford, are we still going to build into the plan more freight and passenger low carbon transit through the tunnel to the mainland? I know about the gauge issues, so it can go further north than London. Thank you.
Cool. So we are still, I mean, certainly as far as the railway infrastructure goes, which is where most of the collaboration is, we are very much still collaborating. The IRU, which is the UIC, it depends which set of initials you use, is the international body. It's not just Europe, it's the world actually, and that technical cooperation is still continuing. There was a suggestion at one stage that they might like a British president, but they decided against it, I think, on the grounds that maybe it wasn't quite the right time to get a Brit to do anything when we just left the EU, but never mind. But we are still very much collaborating, if only because actually the supply market's international. If you look at the remaining train manufacturers, they're internationally based. The signalling market is international. People who build wagons are international. There's a whole raft of things that you buy on the railway which have to be interoperable to get decent specs and decent costs out of the specs. So that will continue. As far as the Channel Tunnel goes, actually there is there's a lot of interest in more freight. I think the same conditions apply as sometimes have applied to post-Brexit freight transit through both British ports and foreign ports. I think some of that's not resolved yet. And obviously we've got a real interest in that. And what I can tell you, because your point is absolutely well made about gauge clearance, that actually a very active piece of the whole industry strategic planning is proper gauge clearance for big containers. Recently the government agreed that should be part of the Transpennine upgrade, which is very welcome, because east-west from Liverpool to Hull and Immingham has been a source of major contention with the freight people for a long time. So we are thinking and doing stuff about that because it's so important. So that at least we're regarding as being a significant thing for the future.
Thank you again, Peter. A very well planned and wonderful insight and vision for the railways, and we're very indebted to you. This is the last lecture in this first series, which have all been absolutely wonderful to participate in, and we do thank all those who have led those lectures as well. Thank you one and all. We wish you all a very, very good evening, and we hope to see you very soon. Thank you.